Welcome back to another episode of Peace Evangelical Lutheran Church's Sermon Podcast. Today, we are reflecting on John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41, in which Jesus heals a blind man while not treating the man's disability as a punishment from God. This story is highly personal to Pastor Travis, who relates today's gospel passage to his own experience with blindness. Listen until the end to hear what today's gospel is really about and to be reminded that when the world pushes you away, Jesus is looking for you.
Most of my life, people talked with me instead of talking to me. They would stand nearby and whisper, sometimes not even quietly, "Why is he blind? Was it something his parents did? Did someone sin?" Imagine hearing people debate your life like that, like you're not even standing there. They weren't really asking about me. They were asking about God. They wanted to know whose fault it was. But no one ever asked what it was like to live in my world. No one asked what it was like to sit beside the road every day, listening to footsteps pass by, to hear voices but never see faces, to learn the shape of the world through sound and memory and touch. I thought the biggest thing about my life was my blindness. But the day I met Jesus, I discovered something surprising. My blindness was never the biggest problem in this story. The bigger problem was how many people see. How many people who could see still couldn't recognize what God was doing right in front of them. And if I step out of the story for just a moment, I have to tell you something. I recognize that conversation because I've heard versions of it in my own life. People wondering what blindness must mean. People trying to explain it. People talking about it before they ever talk to the person living with it. Think about how we talk about people. The blind man, the sick woman, the person with a disability, the addict, the depressed one, as if that one thing tells the whole story about them, as if a diagnosis is a person's entire identity. And that's why this story in John's Gospel matters so much to me, because Jesus refuses to play that game. Back to the story, the disciples asked the question that everyone wants answered. "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Someone has to be responsible. Someone must have done something wrong. Because if this happened by chance, well, what else can happen by chance? But Jesus says the astonishing thing, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Right there, Jesus halts the blame game. Jesus refuses the assumption that blindness or disability is a punishment. Jesus refuses the idea that anyone suffering must be someone's fault. Grace interrupts bad theology. There are things people still say today that are well-meaning, supportive even, but if you're on the receiving end of them, they could land differently than intended. You know the ones. Everything happens for a reason. God won't give you more than you can handle. God must have a plan for this. The church, more often than it should, tries to explain disability instead of listening to people who live with it. Jesus refuses that explanation right here, which is actually a profound act of pastoral care. He doesn't explain, he doesn't theologize the man's condition into meaning. He simply shows up and begins to act. And what Jesus does next is strange. He spits on the ground, makes mud, puts it on the man's eyes, and tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. So he goes, he washes, and suddenly he can see. But here's the thing, that moment of healing, it takes only a minute. The rest of the chapter is about what happens after. The neighbors balk. Is this really the man who begged? The religious leaders interrogated him. How did this happen? They drag his parents in. And when his parents don't give the answers that they want, they call the man back in for more questions. And all of it leads to the same ending. They throw him out of the synagogue. The day he received his sight is the very day that he lost his place in the community. And I think I understand something about that, because sometimes the hardest part of being different isn't the difference itself. It's how people respond to it. Imagine sitting by the road your whole life while people debate whether your existence is a theological problem. That's what's happening in John chapter 9. Watch what happens when the man begins to speak. First, he says, the man called Jesus. Then, he's a prophet. Then, if this man were not from God. And finally, Lord, I believe. He moves from physical sight to spiritual sight. He moves from a man who had no voice in his own story to the only person in the narrative who fully recognizes Jesus. The clearer his sight becomes, the bolder his witness becomes. And something remarkable is happening here. The man who spent his whole life on the sidelines, on the margins, he refuses to be silent. The real sign in this story might not just be sight. It might be the courage of a man finally given his own voice. I remember when someone once asked my wife Kristen a question about me. She was standing right next to me, and the person said, "Can he?" And I remember thinking, you could just ask me. That's exactly the dynamic playing out in this story. Everyone has opinions about the man. Almost no one actually listens to him. And maybe that's where his story and my story begin to meet yours. Because this story really isn't about eyesight at all. It's about how we see the world. The religious leaders asked Jesus, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" And that question hangs over the whole story. Because the people who believe they see most clearly are the ones who miss what God is doing. Meanwhile, the outsider, the man who was the beggar, the man no one listened to, he's the one who recognizes the light. And then the gospel tells us something quiet and beautiful, something we might pass right by without noticing. Jesus heard that they had driven the man out, and Jesus found him. Did you catch that? Jesus goes looking for this man. John doesn't include details just to fill space in his gospel. This is deliberate. This is theological. Jesus seeks him out. That is a true encounter with grace. We often imagine that faith means finding Jesus. But the Gospel of John tells us something different, something more radical than that. Jesus finds us. Take that in for a moment. Feel it. When we are pushed aside, when we are misunderstood, when we are standing outside the systems that believe they see clearly, Jesus finds us. People often assume the miracle in this story is simply that the man born blind begins to see. But I wonder if the deeper miracle is this. A man who spent his entire life on the margins recognizes Jesus more clearly than anyone who believed they had perfect vision. Grace opens our eyes. Grace gives us our voice, and grace finds us when the world pushes us out. And it leads me to the strangest truth in the whole story. The only person who ends up seeing clearly is the one who started out blind. The disciples think they understand suffering. The neighbors think they recognize the man. The religious leaders are absolutely certain they know how God works. But the one person everyone assumed couldn't see anything at all, he's the one who recognizes Jesus. The one who spent his life on the margins becomes the one who finally says, "Lord, I believe." And maybe that's the quiet warning hidden inside this story. Sometimes the people most certain that they see clearly are the ones who miss what God is doing right in front of them. And sometimes the people the world overlooks, the ones pushed to the edges, the ones others talk about instead of listening to, are the very ones who recognize the light first. This story really isn't about blindness, friends. It's about grace. Grace that refuses to blame. Grace that interrupts bad theology. Grace that gives people their own voice. Grace that goes looking for those who have been pushed out. Because when the world pushes someone away, Jesus goes looking for them. And the good news of the gospel is that Jesus is still doing that, still finding people, still opening eyes, still showing up in places where others assume God could never be. And every once in a while, the person no one expected to see anything at all turns out to be the one who recognizes the light. Amen.
That's this week's episode of Peace Lutheran Sermons podcast. Don't forget to join us next week for another episode. Thank you for listening.